At 24,000 feet above occupied Europe, a B-17 flying fortress was torn apart by enemy fire. Metal screamed, fuel burned, and the sky itself seemed to split. In seconds, the aircraft was no longer whole, its tail severed, its fate sealed. Yet amid smoke, wind, and falling debris, one gunner refused to surrender to gravity or fear. As the bomber plunged, he kept firing, not out of rage, but duty, protecting his crew to the very last second. This is not a legend polished by time. This is a documented moment of resolve, when survival and courage collided in free fall. If you value true stories of courage and sacrifice, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a documentary like this. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? In the early years of the Second World War, daylight bombing over Europe was among the most dangerous missions ever flown. Crews climbed into their B-17 flying fortresses, knowing the odds were brutally simple. Many would not return. The B-17 was designed to endure punishment. 4 engines, heavy armor, and a reputation for bringing crews home even when shredded by flak. But no aircraft, no matter how strong, was indestructible. On this particular mission, the bomber climbed steadily through layers of cloud, the engines droning in a synchronized rhythm that filled the fuselage with vibration. The crew moved through their checks with practiced calm. They had done this before. Oxygen masks were secured, guns tested, eyes scanning the pale blue sky. At 24,000 feet, the world below looked unreal. Fields and rivers reduced to patterns, towns like scattered toys. Up here, there was only cold, thin air, and the constant awareness that danger could appear at any moment. The Luftwaffe rarely announced itself. One second the sky was empty. The next, it was alive with motion. Dark shapes rose from the distance, sunlight flashing on wings. German fighters, fast, aggressive, and deadly, climbed to intercept the bomber formation. Almost immediately, the air filled with black bursts of flak, each explosion a violent punctuation mark in the sky. Inside the B-17, the sound was overwhelming. Flak slammed into the fuselage like giant fists. Shrapnel tore through aluminum skin, leaving jagged holes that screamed as air rushed past. The aircraft shuddered but held together. The pilot kept formation, knowing that breaking away made a bomber an easy target. In the waist of the aircraft, a gunner braced himself. His job was brutally clear: defend the bomber from fighters attacking from the rear and sides. He had trained for this moment, rehearsed it in classrooms and mock-ups, but training could never fully prepare a man for the reality of combat at altitude. The cold bit through gloves. The roar of wind and engines was constant, and yet his focus narrowed to the sky behind them. The first attack came fast. A German fighter dove in, guns blazing. Tracers streaked past the bomber, some hitting home with terrifying precision. The gunner fired back in controlled bursts, tracking the enemy through his sights. There was no room for panic, only timing, discipline, and muscle memory. More fighters followed. They came in coordinated passes, exploiting blind spots, forcing the gunners to swivel and adjust. The B-17's defensive guns created a web of fire, but the attackers were relentless. Each second felt stretched, heavy with consequence. Then it happened. A violent explosion rocked the aircraft, far more severe than anything before. The force threw crewmen against bulkheads. Warning lights flared. For a split second, there was silence, an unnatural pause, followed by a terrifying realization. The aircraft was no longer flying normally. It was breaking apart. The tail section had been hit. Structural damage spread instantly. Metal tearing under stress it was never meant to endure. The bomber pitched and yawed, no longer under full control. Loose equipment slammed into walls. The cold intensified as the integrity of the fuselage failed. In the chaos, the gunner understood something fundamental. They were going down. But training and instinct took over. He did not freeze. He did not abandon his position. Even as the aircraft began its fatal descent, enemy fighters were still present. Other bombers in the formation were vulnerable. His crew, his responsibility, was still fighting for survival, so he stayed on his guns. As the B-17 fell, the sky spinning around them, he continued to fire at approaching fighters. Each burst was deliberate. Each second bought time, time for others to escape, time for formation gunners to adjust. Time measured not in minutes, but in heartbeats. The bomber plunged through the thin air, trailing smoke and debris, a wounded giant falling from the heavens. And still, amid wind, noise, and the certainty of impact, one man fulfilled his duty. This was only the beginning of a story that would echo through aviation history, not because of destruction, but because of unwavering resolve. As the B-17 dropped out of formation, the sky around it seemed to expand and contract at the same time. What had once been a carefully ordered grid of bombers was now distant and unreachable. The aircraft was alone. Its descent was not a clean dive, but a violent, uneven fall. Part spin, part plunge, each second stripping away altitude and hope. Inside the shattered fuselage, gravity behaved unpredictably. Men were slammed against the floor, then lifted, then thrown again as the aircraft twisted. Oxygen masks tore loose. Loose ammunition boxes became deadly projectiles. The roar of wind grew louder as the bomber's broken structure allowed the outside world to rush in unchecked. Yet even now, the danger was not only the fall. German fighters circled, wary but persistent. A crippled bomber was still a threat, and also a prize. From above and behind, they moved in cautiously, testing whether the aircraft could still fight back. Many pilots had learned the hard way that a dead B-17 could still bite. The gunner knew this too. Despite the chaos, he stayed anchored at his position, bracing his body against the shaking frame. His world had narrowed to a small circle of sky framed by gun sights. He ignored the screaming metal, the burning smell, the dizzying rotation. His focus was absolute. When a fighter moved into range, he fired. Each burst was an act of resistance against inevitability. The descent accelerated. Altitude dropped in terrifying increments, thousands of feet vanishing in seconds. The cold air at high altitude was now joined by increasing pressure and turbulence as the aircraft fell toward denser layers of atmosphere. The sound changed, becoming deeper, heavier, as the wind clawed at what remained of the bomber. Somewhere forward, the pilots fought for any measure of control. Training told them what the instruments already confirmed. The aircraft was beyond saving. Procedures shifted from recovery to survival. Orders were shouted, barely audible over the noise. Men struggled toward escape hatches, some injured, some dazed, all moving against time. For the gunner, the decision was brutally simple. He would not leave his position until he could no longer fire. Enemy tracers flashed past again. A fighter made a final aggressive pass, perhaps believing the bomber was moments from destruction. The gunner tracked it instinctively, muscles working despite exhaustion and cold. He fired. The fighter veered away, disappearing into cloud and distance. Whether hit or merely driven off did not matter. What mattered was that it did not return. The B-17 continued to fall. At lower altitude, the spin began to slow slightly as damaged surfaces caught air unevenly. The landscape below became clearer. Patches of forest, roads, faint signs of civilization. Each detail sharpened the reality of what was coming. The ground was no longer an abstract concept. It was rising to meet them. Inside the aircraft, the moment arrived when duty shifted. The bomber could no longer be defended. Survival, however uncertain, demanded action. One by one, crew members made their way to exits, wrestling with parachutes, forcing stiff fingers to perform familiar motions learned long before combat. The gunner fired his last bursts. When his ammunition was finally exhausted, the silence felt strange, unnatural after so much noise. He paused, not out of fear but recognition. His role, carried out to its absolute limit, was complete. Only then did he leave his guns. Moving through the damaged fuselage was like navigating a collapsing building in mid-air. Jagged metal cut at clothing. The floor tilted at impossible angles. Smoke stung his eyes, but training again took over. Clip the parachute, check the harness, reach the hatch. The wind tore at him as the exit opened fully to the sky. The roar was deafening, a force that felt eager, almost alive. There was no dramatic pause, no time for reflection, only a single irreversible step. He jumped. For a moment, there was weightlessness, a strange calm after chaos. Then the parachute deployed with a violent jerk, snapping him into the reality of survival. Above him, the canopy billowed, a fragile barrier between life and death. Below, the B-17 continued its doomed descent, smoke trailing as it vanished toward the ground. The battle was over for him, but the story was far from finished. The sudden quiet after the parachute opened was almost unsettling. Where moments before there had been engines, gunfire, and tearing metal, there was now only wind and the faint rustle of fabric overhead. Suspended between sky and earth, the gunner drifted downward, alone with his thoughts and the fading echoes of battle. Below him, the countryside came into focus. Fields stretched in irregular shapes, broken by thin roads and dark lines of trees. Somewhere in the distance, a column of smoke marked the end of the B-17's fall. The aircraft that had carried them through fire and flak was gone now, reduced to wreckage on foreign soil. As he descended, training again guided his actions. He scanned the ground, looking for hazards, calculating where he might land. At this altitude, there was time, but time also allowed reality to settle in. He had survived the fall, but survival did not mean safety. He was alone behind enemy lines. The wind pushed him sideways, altering his path. He could see small villages now, clustered buildings that looked peaceful from above, but represented danger on the ground. Civilians, soldiers, and patrols all shared this landscape, and not all would show mercy. The gunner adjusted his descent as much as the parachute allowed, aiming for open ground away from roads. The landing came hard. He hit the earth with a jolt that drove the breath from his lungs. Pain flared in his legs, but he rolled as trained, collapsing into the grass. For a moment he lay still, listening. No engines, no gunfire, only the distant sounds of the countryside and his own breathing. He gathered the parachute quickly, pulling it in to avoid detection. Every movement felt heavy now that adrenaline was fading. His hands shook, not from fear alone, but from cold and exhaustion. He was alive, but the cost of the mission, the faces of his crew, weighed heavily on his mind. Capture came sooner than escape. Local forces, alerted by the crash and parachutes in the sky, moved quickly. He had covered little distance when armed men appeared, weapons raised, shouting orders in a language he understood only partially. Resistance was impossible and pointless. He raised his hands. As a prisoner of war, the rhythm of life changed completely. Days blurred into each other. Interrogations were methodical, not dramatic. Questions repeated, details tested for inconsistencies. He gave only what he was required to give: name, rank, serial number. Nothing more. Life in captivity demanded a different kind of endurance. Food was scarce, clothing inadequate for the cold. News from the outside world arrived slowly, often distorted. Yet among fellow prisoners, a quiet resilience formed. Stories were shared, routines established, small acts of discipline preserving dignity. And among those stories, his stood out. Other airmen listened as he described the final moments of the B-17, the hit, the fall, the decision to keep firing. There was no boasting in his words, only matter-of-fact recounting, as if he were describing any other mission. But those who heard understood what it meant. They recognized the choice he had made. The war dragged on. Months passed, marked by seasons rather than dates. The gunner watched winter turn to spring behind barbed wire, unsure when or if freedom would come. He thought often of his crew. Who had survived, who had not? Answers came slowly, sometimes not at all. When liberation finally arrived, It did not feel triumphant at first. It felt quiet, almost unreal. Guards disappeared. Gates opened. Allied forces arrived, bringing food, medical care, and confirmation that the war in Europe was ending. Returning home was another journey entirely. Family and friends welcomed him as a hero, but he found it difficult to accept the word. He had done his job. Nothing more, nothing less. The images of that mission, the tearing metal, the falling sky, the final bursts of gunfire, remained with him, vivid and uninvited. Years later, historians and fellow airmen would study that mission. Official reports confirmed what many already believed. His actions during the aircraft's descent had likely prevented further losses. By continuing to fire, he had discouraged enemy fighters from closing in on the damaged bomber and nearby aircraft. Recognition came in the form of medals and citations, words carefully chosen to summarize something far more complex. Courage, duty, extraordinary heroism. Each phrase attempted to capture what happened in those few minutes at 24,000 feet. But for the man himself, the meaning was simpler. He had stayed at his post. In the face of destruction, he had chosen responsibility over self-preservation, not because he thought himself fearless, but because others depended on him. That choice, made in seconds, echoed long after the war ended, and it ensured that his story would not be forgotten. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest memories, but some moments remain untouched. For the men who flew the daylight bombing campaigns over Europe, the war never fully faded. It lived on in sounds, in sudden silences, in the way they looked at the sky. And among those memories, the story of the B-17 cut in half at 24,000 feet endured as a testament to what duty could demand. After the war, the gunner returned to ordinary life, work, family, routine. From the outside, there was little to distinguish him from millions of other veterans who came home and tried to rebuild what the war had interrupted. He rarely spoke about combat unless asked. Like many who had seen too much too young, he understood that some experiences resisted easy explanation. Yet history did not forget him. As decades passed, researchers pieced together mission reports, enemy records, and survivor accounts. They confirmed what had once seemed almost impossible, that during the aircraft's uncontrolled descent, defensive fire had continued. German pilots themselves noted the unexpected resistance from a bomber that should have been finished. That resistance altered their attack patterns, reducing the risk to other damaged aircraft nearby. In military history, outcomes are often measured in numbers. Losses, victories, tonnage dropped. But occasionally, a single decision stands apart. The choice to remain at a gun position while the aircraft fell was not required by any regulation. There was no order that demanded it. It came from an internal code shared by many aircrew. Protect the formation, protect each other, no matter the cost. The B-17 Flying Fortress earned its name not only from armor and firepower, but from the men who crewed it. They turned aluminum and rivets into something stronger than steel. And in that moment over Europe, as one bomber broke apart in the sky, that strength was on full display. Today, restored B-17s sit in museums and air shows, their polished skins gleaming in the sun. Visitors walk through their narrow interiors, touching gun mounts, peering into cramped compartments. To many, they are impressive machines. To a few, they are memories given shape. For historians, the story serves as a reminder that warfare is not defined solely by strategy or technology. It is defined by individuals placed in extraordinary circumstances, forced to make choices in seconds that can echo for generations. For audiences watching now, safe and grounded, the story carries a different weight. It asks a quiet question. What does responsibility mean when escape is possible? When survival conflicts with duty? There are no easy answers, but there are examples. The gunner never claimed to be fearless. Fear was present from the moment the fighters appeared. But courage, as history shows again and again, is not the absence of fear. It is action in spite of it. At 24,000 feet, with the sky falling away beneath him, he acted. Not for recognition, not for glory, but because others were still in danger. That is why his story endures. If this documentary moved you, take a moment to honor all those who served in silence, whose names may never be widely known, but whose actions shaped history all the same. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who values real stories of courage. And in the comments, tell us once more, where are you watching from? Their stories live on because we choose to remember.